Welcome to video 3. In video 3 we are going to talk about quite a few topics. They're a bit shorter than the last ones. We're going to start off with some reading practice on the grand staff. We're going to talk about ledger lines for both treble clef and bass clef. We're going to introduce some new clefs, the alto clef and tenor clef, or as they're known as C clefs. We're going to talk about half steps and whole steps. And we're going to talk about accidentals like the sharp, flat, natural, double flat, and double sharp. And lastly, we are going to talk about what it means to be enharmonic. Why don't we get started? And as you can see in front of us, hopefully you recognize, we have a grand staff. We have our braces, curve brace, bar line, double bar line separating sections, and a double bar line at the end. We also have the treble clef or G clef, known as G clef because it tells us where the note G is on line 2, and the F clef or bass clef because it tells us where F is on line 4. So in music, you might be asked to read some notes on a page. Sounds pretty familiar. If you're asked to read notes, you'll likely be presented with either whole notes or half notes or quarter notes or some other subdivision, and you'll be asked to write the letter name below. Or perhaps you'll be given the letter name and then you'll be asked to plot notes on the treble clef or bass clef or both. So we're going to take a whirl at that. So at first we have some spaces here that look like they should have our answer, and we have some notes up here in the treble clef area. So we're going to start with these. So remember, for treble clef we have our sayings for the lines. The lines, there's 5 of them. From bottom to top is every good boy deserves fudge, or every good boy does fine, meaning that we have notes E, G, B, D, and F. And then the spaces from bottom to top spell face, F-A-C-E. So this first note looks like it's on space 2, and according to our saying, face, A is also on space 2, so it's a pretty sure thing that the answer to this would be A. So next we have one that's a little bit more difficult because it's not part of our saying, but if you remember, the clefs or the staves with clefs go in order of the musical alphabet. When you go downwards, you go backwards through the musical alphabet. When you go up, you go forwards through the musical alphabet. So you know that for spaces, we have E, G, B, D, F. If this is E, and we're on the space below that, which this note is sort of a ledger line, sort of a space note, we're going backwards one letter from E, so backwards one letter would be D. So we have the note D. Alright, here we have a line note, and if we remember every good boy deserves fudge, that seems to fall on space, or excuse me, line 5, which would be F. Here we have line 2, which the saying every good boy deserves fudge is G, but also if you look, it intersects with this swirl of the treble clef or G clef, so that's an extra indicator that that note would be G. And then lastly we have a note that should be very familiar to all of us. We have middle C. If you don't believe me, if we remember that this is note D, this looks like it's the line note right below this space note, so we'll continue one letter backwards in the alphabet, D. The letter before D would be C. So now that we have 5 letters, we can plot 5 notes on the bass clef. And we'll plot the same things. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the same pattern as above, but we know what letters they have to be. So for bass clef, we have some different sayings. For the lines, 5 of them from bottom to top, we have the saying, golden birds do fly away, so G, B, D, F, A. And for the spaces, it doesn't spell a word, but from bottom to top, the saying is all cows eat grass or all cars eat gas. So A, we could either pick space 1 for the saying all cars eat gas, or we could pick line 5 of golden birds do fly away. In this case, I'm going to pick line 5. Whatever you pick is alright. That's personal preference, unless the instructions on a homework or otherwise said to pick a different one. So D. Golden birds do fly away, so I could pick line 3. And then what about all cars eat gas? Well, I don't really have the letter D on any of those 4 spaces, so we'll pick line 3. Golden birds do. Alright, golden birds do fly away, or all cows eat grass, or all cars eat gas. Either one of the sayings you like. So spaces, not really so great. We'll pick line 4. An extra indicator that this is F. Remember that this is bass clef or F clef. It tells us that line 4 is F. So G. We have options now. Golden birds do fly away. So golden, we could pick line 1. Or all cars eat gas. It could be space 4. And I'm going to pick line 1. I've picked all line notes so far. Let's change it up. So golden birds do fly away, or all cars eat gas. Well, space 2 seems to be C. Alright, so we have our 5 notes plotted. Let's do the same now, but in opposite order. So this is sort of a mirror image almost. We'll pick this, letter C. I didn't need to figure that out because I remember from right over here that this is C. I can carry that over. I also have one of these, letter F, right over here. If you didn't remember, golden birds do fly away, so line 4 is F. I also have an example of this. Line 1 is G. Alright, we have space 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. All cows eat grass. Oh, space 4 is also G. And now we have space 1. All cows eat grass. So that must be an A. And now, of course, we have to reverse and go plot for the treble clef. So let's do that now. So C. Where can I put C? I have a few options for this. So every good boy deserves fudge. It's not on one of my 5 lines. What about F-A-C-E? Yes, I could do space 3. I could also place this as middle C. Since we already have middle C, I won't do that one. Instead, I'll place on space 3. So we have F-A-C-E for our 4 spaces, and so the bottom space, or space 1, would work for F. If I didn't want to use that, I could do every good boy does fine, and we'll do that. We will do, and that, let's go through our saying. Let's check, because this often happens when we've done a lot of these. Every good boy deserves fudge. So it looks like we have a note plotted on space 4 instead of, line 4 instead of line 5. That's not a problem. If you did this in pencil, you can erase directly. If not, you can cross it out and draw in your proper note. So G. So we could use line 2. Seems to fit. Every good boy deserves fudge. And in fact, line 2 is the one which is part of treble clef, or a G clef. We have another G. Let's try and pick a different one. So we have F-A-C-E. We don't have any spaces that are G. Every good boy does fine. No other lines, but let's continue on. So remember that the alphabet continues on after we run out of lines and spaces, but it still continues on through an order of space, line, space, line, space, line. So the top line is our last line, so we must continue on with a space note. The next note above this top one, well, if this top one is F, if I'm going up, I must go forward in the musical alphabet. So the letter after F is G. So this top space note must be the letter G, and that it will work for us. Last one is A, and let's continue on with this pattern. So every good boy deserves fudge. So I couldn't use any of my lines, but F-A-C-E. I could use space 2. We're not going to. So if this is G, and I want to continue on, well, I've run out of letters in the musical alphabet, so I'd reset to A. A is what I want, and so I will place a note here. And I have to place a line through it to show that it alternates with this one. If I didn't do that, it would look like this note here. By placing a line through it, I indicate that this is a line note, and without putting a line through it, I indicate that this is technically a space note. So we have G and we have A. And that leads us into our next topic of ledger lines. And ledger lines are notes that no longer fall on a line or space of the staff, but rather move further above it or further below it. So we are going to build on this. So let's move on. So here I have pre-drawn a treble clef and bass clef, and I have not connected them in the grand staff because I don't really have to in this case. And let's try a few things out. So we know a few notes already, quite a few notes, but we can go further than that, right? If we go from, let's say E, we can go lower. E is the first line on treble clef. Every good boy deserves fudge. E is the first line. If I go lower, I have to go backwards in the musical alphabet, so that must be letter D. If I go further down, this must be letter C. That's a line note. The next one must be a space note, and the way I represent that is simply by drawing a note that's a little bit lower, and instead of putting the line through, I put the line above. And now you can kind of see that this line is at the same level, so you see that this one's crossed through the line, and this one is underneath the line. And we'll even go one note further. So the next one would be another line note, so I have to draw 2 lines now, and this note would go through it. We'll go lower still, and we'll even go one further. So how do I read these? Well, the nice thing about this is they are written in order, so that makes this a little bit easier. But the way you start is you count through the alphabet depending on the direction. So these notes go down the musical scale, so we are going to have to go backwards through the alphabet. We know that this first one here is E. We know that this is D. We know that this is C, middle C. So one lower than C would be B, and that's the B below middle C. Below B must be A, the A below middle C. This must be further down than A. Well, A is the first letter of the alphabet, so now we have to jump backwards to G. So now we're at G. And then finally, one behind G would be F. And if you follow these going backwards now, you'll find that they're in order of the alphabet, F, G, A, B, C, D, E. So nothing too obscure there. That's how we represent ledger lines. Now these are lower. We'll do the same thing for bass clef now. Let's start on line 1 of bass clef, and we know that line 1 is G. Pardon me, slipping with our slide here. G, so we'll go a note lower, which would be F. We'll go a note lower, and lower, and lower, and lower, and lower. So we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to follow in order. So we know that this is G. We have to follow the alphabet backwards. So this must be F. This must be E. This must be D. This must be C. This must be B. And this must be A. All right. So we've done below the treble clef and below the bass clef. Now we need to go above both of them. So let's do that. And in order to indicate a new section or a change, like you would see in music, I am going to draw a double bar line. So there is my double bar line. And now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to start on the top line and move upwards. We'll see how much room we have. All right. And I'll do the same for bass clef before we change markers. Now something interesting to note is that you know that both of these clefs share middle C, and it sort of divides them when they're connected in the grand staff. Well, as it turns out, all of these notes are equivalent to notes in the bass clef, except you might see them printed this way if, for example, the music wanted you to play these notes with the right hand instead of the left hand. It might also abbreviate LH or RH next to a passage it wants you to cross over for or use a hand you didn't expect for. But keep in mind that this is middle C, so all of these notes exist on the bass clef or bass staff. On the same token, all of the notes here above middle C from the bass staff overlap with notes we could print on the treble staff. But again, it's just depending on what the music needs you to do. So let's continue on with the way we have. I'm going to slide this down just a little bit so we can see our letters. So we know that from our saying, every good boy does fine, that line 5 of treble staff is F. So now we are ascending through the musical scale or moving up the page. So we can go forwards to the alphabet. Is a little easier than going backwards. So if that's F, this must be G. I'm at the end of my musical alphabet, so I must now reset to A, B, C, D, and E. Same thing down here. Let's use our saying, golden birds do fly away, so line 5 of bass staff is A. Above A must be B. Then we must have C, D, E, F, G. And just for perspective, the third line note of ledger line from bass staff, G, is the same G you might see printed here. So yes, it has ascended that far through the ledger lines that we are that far to line 2 in treble staff. And that's that. You may have a homework that asks you to read these notes and write the letters, or it might give you the letters and ask you to plot ledger lines. So we shall move on from ledger lines now to something that's a little more interesting and a little bit more obscure that you probably won't see too often in piano music, but you should know if you are planning to major in music in college, or if you're planning to take up certain instruments, which we'll talk about, and just to have a general idea that they exist. So before we move on, I'm going to just turn this into a grand staff, just for the purposes of demonstration. So I have my braces that go all the way through. I'll add my curved brace that indicates that these are connected. I now have a system, or the grand staff. And if you're part of a choir, or ever have been in high school, in church, or anything of the sort, you might know the terms soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And these refer to vocal ranges, soprano being the highest, usually a female voice, alto being the second lowest from the high range, tenor being a mid-range for usually males, and then bass, the lowest. And you might have seen this printed on the cover of music, SATB, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And all that refers to is that sopranos sing high, so they're at the highest part of the grand staff, or the higher portion of treble clef. Altos are usually on the lower half of treble clef. Tenors are usually somewhere around the middle range or the upper half of bass clef, and basses are usually below the mid-level of bass clef. And the interesting part is we don't really have a good way to represent this middle section with the grand staff. However, the new clefs we're going to talk about allow us to print more easily in this middle range. And I'm going to swap out this slide for a set of blank staves. I have 2 blank staves here. And the next clef we're going to talk about is called the C clef. And it's actually 2 different clefs, potentially. So first of all, let's draw the first one. And we'll start off by going to the end of our staff, and we'll draw just a vertical line. And now we'll draw sort of a B letter, which swirls in, points to the line 3, and then swirls out again and points back down. So remember that for treble clef or G clef, it pointed out where G is. For F clef or bass clef, it pointed out where F was. Well, if this is called the C clef, it probably points out where C is. And so we'll title this just generally C clef. But this one is actually called the alto clef. And we can have a different one that's very similar. We still start off the same way with our vertical line, except now, instead of pointing out line 3, we point out line 4. And it's still a C clef, so it is still pointing out where C is. And now we call this the tenor clef. So remember that tenors sing in a lower range than altos, right? So if this is C, and this is C, you look at, we have only 2 lines below that and 2 spaces below that. So we don't really access much of these lower notes. We have more of an even distribution of low and high notes. For tenor clef, we have more distribution below this mark, so we actually have access to more of these notes. So remember we said that this is middle C, so these clefs are really representing the space between treble clef and bass clef, and with a little bit of overlap. So if we continue on, and that's letter C, the one before must be B, so the next line down must be A, then G, and then F, and then E, and then D. So if this is C, then the line above must be not D, but E. So we have D, F, A, C, E. And here we have something very similar, except now instead of having D, we only have F, A, C, and then we have E, but instead of ending at E, we go up higher to G. And this is actually G, which is line 2 of treble clef. And this right here is the same as the F, which is line 4 of bass clef. So let's write in our spaces now. So below C would be the letter B, below A would be the letter G, above C would be letter D, and above E would be letter F. Now let's do the same thing down here. Above D would be E, above F would be G, above A would be B, and above C would be D. So we have now created an easy way to access those notes that are in the middle of the grand staff. And this is useful, not so much for piano, but you might see it in piano. It's more so useful for sometimes vocalists, but more often the alto clef is printed for the string instrument, the viola. For tenor clef, it's used a little less frequently, but sometimes printed for the cello or euphonium or trombone. Again, not as often, but sometimes those instruments see this clef. We're now going to move into something a little different than clefs. We're going to go back to our image of a keyboard. Now, last time we talked about how to draw a keyboard. Here I've given us one that's totally drawn out and it has all of the notes already labeled. So if that's not what we're talking about, it must be something new. And we need to talk about something entirely new. We have to talk about something called a half step. And it's not referring to walking down the street and taking half the size of the step that you normally do, but instead something that's half of something else, maybe a whole step. So let's give ourselves a title here. We'll call these half steps. And a half step is considered the smallest move you can make in music. So think of taking a small step or taking a leap. A leap puts you further away from your initial spot. A step would only put you a little bit away. So if we pick any note here, let's say F, and I want to move some distance, I could move all the way over here, I could move back this way, I could move any distance. So F to G, if you look at this and I go from F to G, you'll notice that I don't use up all the buttons, right? I have something in between. I have this black key in between, and we need to talk about these symbols here, but it's not the smallest distance I can move. Instead, if I move F to this key right here, which I can call F sharp or G flat, That is the smallest distance I can move on piano or in tonal music, and that is called a half step. It is the smallest interval being a distance you can move, and it is also a movement where there is no space in between, and movement where there is no space in between. So let me pick another example. If I go from D to E, you'll notice that I have a key in between. If I move from D to E flat or D to D sharp, you'll notice that that's the best I can do. There's no other buttons or keys I could press in between. And this is interesting because we talked in video 2 that even though we have these keys next to each other, they might not be frequency 1 Hertz and then frequency 2 Hertz. They're not right next to each other in the sound spectrum, but they are the smallest interval we can use. However, in the trombone, where you have a slide, if you're moving from D to E flat or D to D sharp, you might not hit that pitch perfectly, and in fact you can access those frequencies in between here. And that's why sometimes you might hear a tone that's out of tune. Same thing with violins. Violins do not have a fretboard, so they don't have a set limited number of frequencies they can play. Instead, you can slide through all of the frequencies in between. However, in music theory and on the piano, we can only access from this note to this note. So half step is that smallest possible move we can make. So why is a half step important? Well, we need to talk about one other thing further. We need to talk about accidentals. But before we move on to accidentals, for common sense, you might imagine that a whole step is simply 2 half steps. So if I move from G to G sharp or G to A flat, that's a half step. If I move a half step higher from A flat to A or G sharp to A, that's another half step, so 1 and 1. So G to A is a whole step. And let me use a square bracket to indicate a whole step, and let me use a sort of pointed bracket to represent a half step. So you'll notice I have one here and I have one here. So 2 half steps make up a whole step. There are 2 places on the keyboard and in music where you have 2 natural pitches that are not a whole step apart but are a half step apart. And you might notice it here where there's not a black key. And that's why piano is very useful in music theory. It's a very visual way to represent what we're talking about that might seem abstract. So from B to C, if I press the key B and then I press the key C, there's no other button I could push. So that is in fact not a whole step, but a half step. And E to F is the same thing. There's no button in between. They're right next to each other. This is a half step. And you notice I use the pointed brackets for half step and a square bracket for whole step. So now we need to move on to something called accidentals. And accidentals are the things that we write that allow us to, instead of use these natural white keys, to use these accidentals or black keys. And they are the sharp, the flat. We can have this guy, the X, which is a double sharp. We can have this guy, which is a little bit more straightforward, a double flat. And we can also have this one, the natural. So, for example, what an accidental can do is it can either lower or raise a note 1 half step. If it's a double, it does it 2 times. And that seems pretty straightforward if you think of the word double before anything. So I'll highlight these. and these lower things. And then these up here, the sharps or double sharp, they raise things. Right? Think of a flat tire in a car. A flat tire in a car has lower air pressure than that of a fully inflated tire. Sharps raise things. So for example, and we can see this on the keyboard here, that if we take the note C, for example, and we add a sharp to it, a sharp says we should raise it 1/2 step. Well, 1/2 step up from C, or the smallest amount of movement we can make so that there's nothing in between, well, C up to C sharp is right here. And in fact, we call that note C sharp. Same thing for a flat. Let's pick the note D. If I want to flat the note D, that means lower it 1/2 step. So I'd come down to this key right here, 1/2 step, and in fact that's called D flat. And that's why it can have two names. It's the same button, the same frequency of sound, but it has two names. A double flat, well, let's think of that. A double flat means to do 2 times what a normal flat would do. A normal flat lowers things 1/2 step, so a double flat must lower things 2/2 steps. If I pick the note D here, and I flat it once, I'd come down to D flat. If I flat it again, I have to move the smallest amount possible 1 time down here, and that would bring me to C. So D double flat is actually the note C. Well, let's talk about one more interesting one. Let's talk about this note right here, C flat, and this note right here, B sharp. Well, C flat is the same thing as B, because if I lower C 1/2 step, I get to this note right here, B. Going to B flat here would be moving 2/2 steps, which is why it's not a black key. Same thing with B sharp, I have to move up 1/2 step, so B sharp is actually C. Same thing for E sharp being F, and F flat being E. And of course, we could technically add as many flats as we like, or as many sharps as we like, so we could have a quadruple sharp, or a triple sharp, or a quadruple flat, or a triple flat. We don't really see that. It would be very difficult to read and use in common practice, but in theoretical constraints, it is possible. So we have the natural now, and what a natural does is it cancels out a sharp. So if in my music I used a note that was sharp, and then I wanted to go back to the white key, I would put the natural before it. Now you'll notice that in writing this, I have the names printed with the letter first, and then the operation, or the accidental, so G sharp, and it makes sense to read it that way. However, when you see notes on a page, you will see the accidental come before the note, which makes sense because you wouldn't want to find out that news after you had already played the natural key. So let's pick C right here. Let's say that instead of C natural, a white key, I wanted to play C sharp. If I put C sharp and I put the sharp over here, you might imagine that an instrumentalist would play E, D, C, and then realize that C should have been sharp. So when in practice, we put the sharp that looks like it's on the same line or space as the note right before the note. So that's C sharp. Now, accidentals carry through measures, and we'll talk about that more later. So after a bar line, so once I move into a new measure, if I see that note again, C, it will return to C natural. However, if I were to see another C right here, this note, even though it doesn't have a sharp, is still sharp because it's in the same measure, and I haven't canceled that operation with a natural. However, if I slap a natural right next to that note, I have solved my problem, and it is now once again C natural. So the last thing we're going to talk about, and it's nothing too much to grasp, it's just a name for something we've already talked about, is what happens when we have notes that have two different names, but they're the same frequency or same button on the piano. Well, that would be called enharmonicism. So when things are enharmonic, it means that they produce the same frequency or same tone, but they might have a different spelling. So it's two notes with different names, but the same frequency or pitch. And that, for example, is where we talked about B sharp equaling the note C, or G sharp equaling A flat. And let's go back to our keyboard. So remember here, if we look at B sharp, it is in fact the note C, and if we look at G sharp, it is also A flat, because the flat lowers A 1/2 step, A flat, or the sharp raises G 1/2 step, so G up to G sharp. So a whole step is 2 half steps. A half step, again, is the smallest amount of space we can move on a piano or in the tonal music system, the staff. And the half step is really something we're going to use over and over. Whenever we measure the amount of space between two notes, we're always going to make that measurement using how many half steps are in between them. I hope this has helped, and I hope to see you in the next video.